everyone. Thank you all for being here. For those of you who don't know, I'm Professor Michael Hughes. I work as the lab coordinator for the science department. I also work in online course development, and I teach a variety of biology and wildlife related courses here at Southeastern. This semester we're doing ornithology, which is all about birds. We're actually doing our first ornithology field trip later this afternoon, which will be a lot of fun. And I've been interested in wildlife and photography since I was little. I started doing wildlife photography around age 7 or so. So you'll see examples of my own photography. This is an older photo of our backyard throughout this presentation. But I have to give you a disclaimer, as cell phone cameras have gotten better and better over the years. I've gotten lazier and lazier as a photographer. So especially when it comes to insects, which you'll see some in this presentation, you'll notice the image quality is pretty poor when it's blown up on a big screen, and that's because I do most of my insect photography with my phone now instead of my actual camera. So this is my family. This is my wife Jess and our daughter Coral Capri, who is going to be a year old in just a few weeks. And we are together growing a food forest in our backyard here in Lakeland. And Coral loves going out in the food forest and helping. And by helping, I mean putting random things in her mouth trying to see what she can eat and what she can't eat. But she loves it, and it's been such a fun and rewarding experience growing food in our own backyard that I thought I'd share that with you all today. So as we get started, I'd like to give a little bit of context on where we're going today. So a food forest is a landscape or a garden design that is focused on copying or emulating the structure and function of a native forest. And so if you've ever been in a forest, I think you kind of intuitively know what that structure looks like. You have these taller canopy trees that make up the canopy. Then you have smaller trees in the understory. You have shrubs, you have vines, ground covers. And all of these plants and all of these different layers work together to make a functional ecological system. And a food forest is intentionally designed to mimic those layers, so you fill in different species at each of those layers. And as you do so, those layers of the food forest work together not only to make an ecological system like a natural forest, but an ecological system where at every layer there are things that you can harvest and use from that, whether that's fruits or nuts or spices. If you're growing certain kinds of trees, you can get building materials, lumber, firewood, things like that. So as we go through today's talk, I'm going to talk about specifically how to grow a food forest here in Central Florida, but a lot of these principles are going to be applicable wherever you are in the world. You just have to choose a different set of species to fill in those ecological roles. If you're in a desert climate, for instance, the set of species you choose to grow in a food forest will be quite a bit different than the ones that you would grow here in the subtropics in Florida. And part of today's talk, I'm going to explain not only how to grow a food forest, but also why, because it's, in my opinion, actually a really important topic, because the way that we grow food here in America is kind of the total opposite of what I'm going to be talking about with food forests. Food forests focus on long-term systems and focus on growing food in an ecologically aware manner, whereas our modern agricultural practices tend to focus on efficiency and yield, but ignore the ecological component, which is interesting to me because anytime you're growing anything, whether it's a huge 100+ acre field of corn or whether it's a food forest, when you have plants in the ground, it's going to form an ecosystem. And those ecosystems are going to be very different depending on the diversity of plants. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And I want to give a disclaimer right from the start. I've only been growing food for about 5 years. So there are a lot of people that are a lot more experienced than me and a lot better qualified to give this talk. But hopefully it's a little bit encouraging to you because it kind of serves to support the point that you don't have to be some sort of expert to grow your own food. I think anybody who likes to eat food and loves to learn could grow their own food with no problem. So that's what we're going to do today. And I want to start off by mentioning 5 years ago is when I started growing food. And that was because we lived in Missouri. And a lot of my clients and coworkers at the time were growing their own food. It's kind of a big part of the culture where we were living. And so I wanted to grow bell peppers. I like to eat bell peppers. I thought it would be fun. So I did the typical Michael thing, which is just do as much intensive research as I possibly can. And I'm like, okay, let's get 10 pepper plants. And my wife, being the voice of reason, said, let's start this way. Let's get one pepper plant. You have to name it, because if you name it, you're more likely to keep it alive. And if you keep it alive, then you can think about getting more plants. So I did, got one pepper plant, I named it, kept it alive, and enjoyed the harvest from it later. And then we went back to Home Depot, got Cherokee purple tomatoes, and harvested them. Here's a picture of what a Cherokee purple tomato looks like. This was something that we grew last year in our food forest. We've continued to grow this one because it's a fantastic variety. It is delicious. It has a lot of a more dense flavor, has more sweetness and a lot less acidity than your store-bought tomatoes. And this is a tomato you can't buy in the stores. And so we thought, wow, if we can grow this and it tastes so good, by far the best tomato I'd ever eaten, what else can we possibly grow that you can't buy in a store that tastes better? So that's kind of my own selfish reason behind learning about food, is because I love to eat, and I love to eat great food, and if we can grow food that you can't buy in the store, then why not? Actually, Dr. Straw gave a really good description of the Cherokee purple tomato one time. He said it's almost like biting into a plum. They're so sweet, and you get a lot of fruitiness from them. So then we moved to Florida, and Florida is totally different when you're growing food compared to most of the rest of the country, because we are in a subtropical climate. So if you try to grow during the typical seasons that you would grow food in most of the rest of the country, it will not work in Florida because our seasons are very different here. So I started doing a lot of research. What are the foods that we can grow here in Florida? And I dove full into the research, watched YouTube videos, and read as much as I could about agriculture. I read some of the Roman author Columella's agricultural works from around 2,000 years ago, read about Thomas Jefferson's really brilliant gardening endeavors at his home in Monticello in Virginia. And this thing that kept coming up in all of my research was this term, permaculture. If you've heard of this term, permaculture is a combination of permanent and agriculture. It's kind of this idea of growing food in long-term permanent systems, as opposed to focusing on how much corn, wheat, soy could we get out of this field in one season. So it's a very different approach compared to traditional agriculture. And I say that with a little bit of hesitation, because our current traditional methods of agriculture are very atypical in the scale of world history. Only in the past 100+ years or so we've been growing food the way that we have been here in an industrial manner. So permaculture is something that kept coming up in my research when it came to growing food. And so permaculture, I'll give you an example here. It was an ancient concept, but one that is, again, now called permaculture, that was first stumbled upon by accident in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco in 1975 by a guy named Jeff Lawton, who was an Australian ecologist. He was on a trip in Morocco with some other ecologists, and if you know anything about Morocco, you know it is an extremely dry desert, right? There's the Atlas Mountains, but most of Morocco is extremely dry. And he kept hearing about this lush forest. So they went and they found this forest. This is a picture of it. This was a food forest, after doing some reading and talking about it with the people that were there growing this food, that had been planted probably around 2,000 years ago. So this system is growing, and I have a list here. In the shade of tall date palms were trees, vines, and shrubs bearing bananas, tamarinds, oranges, figs, guavas, pomegranates, lemons, limes, mulberries, carrots, quince, grapes, olives, and other fruits, nuts, vegetables, and herbs. There were even chickens, goats, and donkeys in this system. And this system had great fertility, even though it's been farmed at that level of intensity for over 2,000 years, which that got their interest, because as an example, here in the US, we've been intensively growing food in monoculture systems for just over 100 years, and we've largely depleted a lot of the fertility in our soil in less than 100 years. So they started wondering, how is this system still fertile after all that time? And I have a QR code here that links to an interesting article by Atlas Obscura. It's worth a read if you ever get a chance. That kind of talks about the discovery of this food forest and some of the things that came from it. So the inspiration and ideas that came eventually from this food forest in Morocco really ended up causing what I think is possibly one of the greatest paradigm shifts in agricultural history. And that's the idea that we need to think of food in terms of long-term systems. Thinking of food production in terms of long-term ecology rather than short-term efficiency. And part of this is thinking of these agricultural landscapes for what they are, which is ecosystems, not industries. Because anytime you're growing plants anywhere, it's going to form some sort of ecosystem. And again, if you contrast the modern method of monoculture, that's going to be a very different ecosystem than one that has a lot of plant diversity. And the central concept is this. Again, if you focus on plant diversity will build ecosystems that are more biodiverse. So to give an example of this, like I said, we're growing a food forest in our backyard. We have now, through seeds and cuttings and things that we bought on sale, we have now over 250 different species of plants in our backyard. And one of the best ones that you can grow here in Florida is wild coffee. No relation to true coffee at all. It's called wild coffee because the leaves look like coffee leaves. And here's a video from our backyard. I think I took this last year. It has kind of not very showy flowers, kind of nondescript, but you can see how many pollinators are attracted to this plant. And so what you get when you have high plant diversity is you get a high diversity of insects. Often specific insects have relationships with specific plant species, so the more diversity of plants you have, the more diversity of insects that you get. And so to kind of help demonstrate this concept, here are a few other photos. If you notice in this video, most of these are the same species of wasp. And then there's actually a lady beetle up there, and over here are some sweat bees. This is the one species that was predominant there. This is Dialis octomaculata. It's a scoliate wasp. And they really like this wild coffee. Here are some other examples. There's another scoliate wasp on the top left, that's Scolia dubia. You may have seen this before, they're actually pretty common here. They're great to have around because they are specialized predators of grubs that are pests of lawn and turf grass. So if you have a section of grass in your backyard, there are beetles that have their grubs that live in the soil and eat the roots of the grass, and that's what those wasps eat. And before leaving wasps, I did want to mention, I think wasps are often one of the most overlooked groups of animals on the planet. Arguably, in my opinion, they are probably one of the most important groups of animals on the planet. Usually wasps perform two functions. They are pollinators and they are predators. They are really, really good predators of all kinds of pest species. And again, they're great pollinators as well. This is Agapostum splendens. This is a sweat bee. That's probably the most common pollinator during the summer months in our backyard. They're really cool. They're a native solitary bee species. For those of you that didn't know, honeybees are not native to North America. They are invasive here. And native bees like the sweat bee are a lot more efficient pollinators than honeybees. And then here on the bottom left is another predator. This is really small, but if you sit almost anywhere in Florida for long enough and pay attention to the leaves, you will probably see this. This is Condylostylus. It's a long-legged fly, and they are awesome predators. They eat a lot of gnats and mosquitoes in particular, so I really like having these guys around because I hate mosquitoes. And here's a different plant here with a different wasp on it. This is Ethiopian kale that's gone to seed, and this is a totally different species. This is a Typhiid wasp. This is Myzinum, and these are all of the Myzinum wasps that are attracted to this particular plant in the backyard. And of course, as you attract all of these different species, you're going to naturally attract the insect predators of those species. I mentioned that wasps are kind of filling both roles as pollinators and predators. This one is a more specialized predator. This is the milkweed assassin bug. These are really cool. They eat all kinds of pests in the yard and garden. Here are a few others here. This is a green tree frog, which was really exciting to see in the backyard because you don't see green tree frogs very often in Florida anymore at all because they've been largely outcompeted by Cuban tree frogs. You guys have probably all seen Cuban tree frogs. Those are the large tan ones. Whereas green tree frogs are a lot smaller and they don't compete as well with the Cuban tree frogs. So that was good to see. This is the caterpillar of our state butterfly, the zebra longwing. So if you grow any kind of passion flower in the shade, that will attract zebra longwing butterflies. And then on the top right there is Centris nitida. That's a Central American oil bee, which is another really cool and specialized species. So you can start to see how if you have a diversity of plants, it builds an ecosystem. And it starts with insects and then it trickles all the way up to other organisms like this is a great crested flycatcher, which last year, probably second or third week of April, they started nesting in a nest box that we built for them in our backyard, and they ended up fledging 5 of their offspring later, a few weeks later, and they were attracted to our yard because there's lots of insect diversity that they can eat. So, as we continue thinking about things as building an ecosystem, I'm reminded of a quote by Barry Commoner, who's an ecologist, who said that the first law of ecology is that everything is connected to everything else. And so you'll see that throughout this presentation, especially as it relates to plants. But this diversity of plants producing biodiversity above ground also produces biodiversity below ground. And this is actually potentially even more important. So in the soil, there are mineral nutrients like calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium, sodium, phosphate, nitrate, ammonium, and so forth that are needed for plants to be able to grow. The biggest 3 for plants are forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And the way that these exist in the soil, they can exist either in water-soluble form, which is how most fertilizers are applied, or they can exist bound to soil particles. So if you look at an individual soil particle under a microscope, it looks something like that. That's my crude PowerPoint drawing of a soil particle. They look a little bit like an asteroid or lava rock, something like that, where they have all of these divots or binding sites for mineral ions in the soil. So let's say this one particular soil particle has calcium, magnesium, and potassium bound to it in the soil. Plants have roots that go through the soil, but those roots are not capable of chelating or removing those mineral ions from soil particles. But bacteria can. So bacteria come in and they can chelate or pop off those mineral ions from soil particles and use them for whatever they need them for. And what is the lifespan of microbes compared to plants? Really, really short. So the bacterium is then going to die, and that mineral ion is then going to be in a bioavailable form for plants' roots to get. So what plants do is photosynthesis, right? You can think of plants and their leaves as a bunch of little solar panels, and what they do is they take energy from sunlight and they use it to combine carbon dioxide from the air with water from the soil to make sugars. Turns out up to 40% of the sugars that they make, they don't even use themselves. They pump them directly back into the ground in the form of root exudates. So if you think about all that a plant is doing to photosynthesize, to take almost half of what it's producing and not even use it, pumping it back into the ground tells you that's a really important process, right? So what these root exudates are sugars that attract soil microbes, because those soil microbes like to eat those sugars. Those soil microbes then are attracted to live in their root zone of the plant, where they can chelate mineral nutrients from soil particles, and then as those bacteria die, then those mineral nutrients can be taken up by the plant's roots and expressed in their leaves and tissues. So what happens is, if you have a system with a diversity of plants, then you get a diversity of root exudates, which results in a diversity of soil microorganisms, which chelate a diversity of soil nutrients, which makes crops or plants that are more nutrient dense, which results in more nutritious food for people. And that's not just the plants that we're eating, but also the animals that we eat, if they are eating plants in a diverse system, will end up being more nutrient dense as well. There was an interesting study done, I believe it was in 2021, by a Norwegian scientist who was looking at the phytochemicals, which are plant-produced chemicals that are sequestered into the tissue of beef. And what they found was that in feedlot cattle, there might be 200 something different phytochemicals in the meat itself, whereas cattle that were raised in open grasslands that had a diversity of plants had something like 580 different kinds of phytochemicals that are then in the meat, and a lot of these phytochemicals are really useful for people either as antioxidants or nutrients, things like that. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, the first main point about why we grow food forests is this: because the key to growing highly nutritious food is growing food in systems with high plant diversity, because of all of that we just mentioned. And the main reason for that is because it builds a healthy soil microbiome. And I have to stop here for just a second, because the correlations between the soil microbiome and the human microbiome really are striking. So in both cases, the health of the system, whether that system is a human person or an ecological system, is largely dependent on the microbial diversity within the gut of the system, or the digestive portion of the system. In humans, that occurs in our gastrointestinal tract. In ecological systems, that happens in the soil, because the soil essentially acts like the digestive system of nature, where it takes nutrients, breaks them down, and uses them to build things, right? Reminds us that we're made from the soil, right? So if we look at this in contrast with modern industrial agriculture, let's say a farmer wants to grow a field of corn. Could be 100 acres, 200 acres, thousands of acres of corn. The goal is to grow exclusively corn. So the farmer is going to apply herbicides to keep all weeds out of the system. Weeds are actually just an indicator of soil health in a lot of senses. That's a topic for another time. But what you end up with is a system with low plant diversity. The goal here is to have a plant diversity of 1, which is corn, right? So if you have a low diversity of plants, you end up with a low diversity of root exudates, a low diversity of soil organisms, which results in a low diversity of soil nutrients, which results in plants that have nutrient deficiencies often, and ends up producing food with lower nutritional quality. And so, again, using this same example, let's say you have a low plant diversity, it's just corn. As a result of that, you also have a low diversity of insects, because you don't have all of those different species attracting specific insects that they are attracted to. If you have low insect diversity, then you also get fewer natural predatory insects as well. And this combines to produce increased pest pressure for 2 reasons. 1, because you have fewer natural predators of those insects, but 2, if you are a pest of corn, for example, and you find thousands of acres of corn with no predators, that is a great scenario for you to expand your population. So as a result, farmers will often apply pesticides to control that problem. Also, if you have a system with low plant diversity, because it produces a low diversity of soil nutrients, then you also end up with a low diversity of soil nutrients. So farmers will apply synthetic fertilizers. Up to 80% of synthetic fertilizers that are applied in farms run off into local bodies of water, where they act as a form of pollution, which cause eutrophication, which causes massive ecological problems, eventually resulting in things like the Gulf of Mexico, or I guess the Gulf of America dead zone now, where every year, a few months after pesticide application throughout the Midwest, which all drains into the Mississippi River, which flows into the Gulf of America near Louisiana, you end up with a massive dead zone where all of those nutrients cause algae blooms. Those algae then bloom and die. Decomposition uses a lot of oxygen, so it makes the water extremely anoxic and basically kills almost everything that lives within that zone. On average, the size of that Gulf of Mexico dead zone is about the size of walking from the east coast of Florida straight across to the west coast of Florida, and then having 20 miles on your right and 20 miles on your left the whole way be completely devoid of oxygen in the ocean. So it causes all kinds of problems with the application of fertilizers. So when you apply, or when you grow food in systems with low plant diversity, it results in food that's less nutritious, results in the application of herbicides and pesticides. There's been a ton of studies I could share with you all about the contamination of the food that we're eating. That's not the point of today's talk, but in most of these cases, even for pesticides and herbicides that have been banned for decades, they usually find detectable levels of those chemicals in at least 2/3 of the people that are sampled for most of these pesticides and herbicides. And then it again uses synthetic fertilizers, which cause all of the problems ecologically of eutrophication. Not to mention, synthetic fertilizers use a lot of energy for their synthesis. There was a study published in 2021 that found that food production is the primary threat to about 86% of species that are threatened with extinction globally. So of all the species that are threatened with extinction, the main threat for 86% of those species is the way that we grow our food. So that tells you there's a big problem with the way that we're growing food. And the solution to that is really simple. It's growing food in systems with high plant diversity. And one of the ways to do that is permaculture, and one of the best ways to do that, in my opinion, here in Florida especially, is growing a food forest. So that's what the rest of today's talk will be focused on. Before moving from theory to practice, are there any questions about anything that I've just covered so far?
What's the name of the tomato?
Cherokee purple.
Cherokee purple. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And you can buy plants of Cherokee purple sometimes at Home Depot. Seed packets are cheaper and you get a lot more
Okay,
from them.
thank you.
Any questions about the ecology of kind of the way that ecological systems work as they pertain to food production? Okay, so we're going to talk about planning, planting, maintenance, and results for making a food forest. And again, this is specific, the examples I'll give are specific to Central Florida, but if you choose a different set of species, which you can just look up depending on where you're living, these same general principles apply in most places in the world. And what's cool about food forests is they work really well in a backyard system, but they're also completely scalable as well. So one example I'll give is the Great Green Wall project in Africa. Has anybody heard of that project? So the Great Green Wall is the theory is they want to plant a row of trees across the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, across the entire continent of Africa from west to east, to keep the Sahara from spreading further south. And when they started this, they started just doing massive tree planting, like you often see, like carbon credits or whatever, where you can, plant this number of trees in a certain area. Well, what they were doing was they were planting one species of tree. So they're making a monoculture and they were consistently failing and it was not working. So eventually somebody said, let's start doing food forests instead. So they did this in Senegal. And in Senegal, they planted 528 food forests. Part of food forest production is designing the system in such a way to collect and store rainwater, which recharges aquifers over time. And since they've planted these 528 food forests in Senegal, it has taken 500,000 people off of food assistance. So these people are able to not only produce all of the food that they need but it's also recharged the aquifers, which allows them to farm year-round by using wells, which allows them to produce a surplus of food so that they can also sell their produce to other places. And so when you talk about 500 food forests taking 500,000 people off of food assistance, it's really an impactful thing when you take it up to scale. But today we'll just focus on kind of the backyard food forest. So the first step is planting. There are 12 principles of permaculture. I won't go into those today, but the first principle is observe and interact. Basically spend time in the area where you're going to grow a food forest or a permaculture system. See where the light is, where it's shady, where it's sunny throughout the day, not just at a certain part of the day. Look at the topography of the land, see where water pools up, where water drains off really fast. Look at the soil as well. Here in Florida, we have really sandy soil, but we actually have a fair bit of clay in certain parts as well. Also, you want to look at areas that have pre-existing structures, sheds, or your house, or pre-existing trees. Pre-existing trees are really good to look for because what trees do is they often drop their leaves, and those leaves will eventually break down into compost, which will fertilize the system. So in our food forest, I'll show you this in just a minute here, we decided to, we've been in our house for less than 2 years, but we had a tree that's been there for about 20 years, a live oak tree. So it has been consistently mulching a certain spot of the yard for 20 years. So it gave us a 20-year head start on the fertility of our soil underneath that tree. And the difference in growth rates between that spot and the other exposed parts of the yard is really striking. So one thing I would recommend, there's a really cool tool called Contour Map Creator, if you just Google that, where you can put in your address. So this is our property here in Lakeland. You can draw a box around your property and set the interval height, and it will show you the topography of your site. Most of Florida is very, very flat, but even within that, no land is really perfectly flat. Even if it falls an inch over 1,000 feet, water is still going to trend in that direction. And so you can see here at our property, our highest spot here is the front yard, and it drops pretty substantially. There's a 7-foot vertical distance between the side of our yard and the back of our yard, which is a pretty steep slope for Florida. So what this tells us is water is going to flow in this direction. This is the high spot. This is going to be the driest spot of the property. This is the lowest spot back here, so that's going to be the wettest part of the property. And so what you can do, I'll talk about swales in just a minute, is you can dig little trenches on contour. So we've actually done that here, where if you follow these contour lines, when water flows down that slope, it'll hit that trench and spread out. It'll slow its flow, and it'll soak that water in on the other side of that. So those are just some things to think about when you're designing a food forest. The second part is probably my favorite. That's figuring out what you want to grow. And by what do you want to grow, I mean, what do you want to eat? That's the way I think of it. It could be fruits or vegetables or salad greens. You might be able to incorporate quail or chickens into your system. It really just depends on what you want to grow and eat. The example I have here, this is a peach tree. That's a Florida Grand Peach. It was actually a gift from our realtor when we moved in. And it produced its first 4 fruits last year. And right now it's producing some smaller fruits. If you've never tried, these are a tropical peach. If you've never tried a tropical peach, they are fantastic. Here in Florida, we are at the extreme southern edge of the range of peaches. And I'll get into that in just a second, but because of our warm climate here, the peach fruits develop more sugars and more flavor compared to further north. They really are fantastic. So I'd recommend, figuring out what you want to eat and make a list of it. A few search terms that might help you. Here in Lakeland, we are right on the edge of zone 9B and 10A. Those are agricultural zones, really just refers to the amount of frost that we get and the minimum temperatures that we get every winter. So if you look up things that would live in like zones 9 through 11, you'll find a lot of plants. There are literally thousands of plants that could grow in our climate. I think there's something like 30,000 species of edible plants globally, and as a total human population, we only intensively cultivate about 170 of of those 300,000 or 30,000 species, and globally, about 40% of human calorie intake daily comes from corn, comes from wheat, and comes from rice. So 3 species of plants produce almost half of the daily calorie intake of all the 30,000 species that are available for us. Another good search term is subtropical, just because that's our climate here. And definitely look for things that are heat tolerant, that can tolerate our summers. So really quickly, before moving on from the peaches, I wanted to make a note about chill hours, because this will help influence your decision. Chill hours are the amount of hours every winter between 32 degrees, so between a freeze, and 45 degrees. Chill hours are really important to look up for whatever you're wanting to grow, because plants need a certain amount of chill hours in order to biologically stimulate flowering, and of course flowers are what will eventually become fruit. So for peaches, most peaches require 400 plus chill hours. Here in Lakeland, we're in the 100 to 200 chill hour range, so most peaches won't fruit in Florida. That's why we have a Florida Grand Peach, which can fruit with a lot lower chill hours. We had, I think, 178 chill hours this winter. Last winter, we got only 22, and that peach still flowered and set fruit at that time. But if you look at this list here, most apples, cherries, plums, and pears, you just can't grow them in Central Florida. You could grow them, they just won't flower, so they won't fruit. So keep in mind chill hours if you're when you're planting. So then take those plants that you wanted to grow. This is AI's interpretation of a food forest. I don't know why there are like random piles of fruit on the ground that are not fruit, not spoiling, and I'm not sure why that live oak tree is producing oranges. But get your list of plants that you want to grow and kind of slot them into those layers of the food forest, whether those are canopy trees, understory trees, and so forth. So again, here is just a quick refresher of what those different layers look like. And I'll go through each of these layers in a little bit more detail here with some possible examples to inspire you to do this yourself. So we'll start with the canopy trees. This is our canopy tree from our food forest. That's the one I mentioned. That's a live oak tree. They're great for mulching. They drop their leaves periodically every winter. Here in Florida, we also have some other native species: pecans, hickory, pine, chestnut. Some of these canopy trees, again, if they're already present, might be a good starting point for a food forest. Trumpet trees are fantastic. That's not my picture, but I'm sure you guys have seen those all blooming over the last few weeks here in Lakeland. Avocado is a great canopy tree for a Florida food forest, because once those fruits are ripe, they'll drop to the ground, so you don't have to like climb up into a huge tree to get the fruit. Trumpet trees are also, they used to be in the genus Tababua, so a lot of like local Floridians will call them Tababua. They're no longer in that genus, they're now in Andromanthus, but you can call them Tababua or trumpet trees, and there are different colors of those too. Understory trees is where it gets really fun. This is where you can grow all kinds of different delicious fruits. Mangoes are fantastic. If you've ever had a fresh mango off of the tree, it is like a totally different fruit compared to a store-bought mango. They're really, really good. These are all pictures from our backyard food forest. We have a papaya tree. Papaya grows really, really fast and is super productive. That's one of Coral's favorite fruits right now. Bless you. You can grow peaches and loquats and lychees and figs. This is just barely scratching the surface, by the way. Moringa, I have that highlighted here. Moringa is one of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. If you look up the nutritional content of moringa leaves, it's essentially like taking a multivitamin. It's incredible. It's super easy to grow. I planted some moringa seeds in June of last year, and by December, they were already 15 feet tall, had a trunk around this big, and I'd already pruned them probably a dozen times at that point. They grow really, really fast. Bananas and guavas. Bananas are an interesting one because dwarf Cavendish, or regular Cavendish bananas are what you see at the store. Sometimes you see some of the smaller ladyfinger bananas, but there are something like 1,000 different varieties of bananas, and in the store you can buy only 2 of them. And those are the 2 that keep longest on the shelf. You'll notice that with a lot of these different fruits, is that the ones you can buy in the store aren't necessarily the ones that taste the best. They're the ones that either look the best or the ones that keep the longest. A great example of this is sugar apple. You won't see sugar apple for sale in the store. That one is little, they get about maybe twice that size because they don't store very well. But that is a fantastic fruit. You peel it apart. They have all those little sections you can see. You peel it apart, and on the inside, you eat it with a spoon. It's like a custard texture. We tried our first one from our sugar apple tree last year, and it tastes like vanilla custard with a tropical fruit flavor. It is fantastic. Jess immediately said it's her favorite fruit she's ever eaten. Really, really, really good. Jamaican cherries, black sapote, white sapote, peanut butter fruit, jujube, persimmons and citrus. Barbados cherries, the red ones here, those are some muscadine in the same hand there. Barbados cherries grow super well as well, and each individual cherry has more than an entire day's worth of vitamin C in it. You could also grow starfruit and jaboticaba and literally hundreds of other subtropical fruits from around the world. Next is the shrub layer. Here you can also grow some really cool things like Patanga Suriname cherry, rainforest plums, Rio Grande cherries. All four of those are in the genus Eugenia, which is a really cool genus that produces a lot of fruit bearing plants. Rainforest chili peppers I've shown here because they're a perennial pepper. They can live up to 7 years long in age, and they're really super easy. I had 2 rainforest chili pepper plants that I started from seed, and one time last summer I went out and I picked 180 peppers off of 2 plants at one time. The problem is they're too spicy for me to eat. So, because if I eat food that's too spicy, it gives me hiccups uncontrollably, which is unfortunate. So we ended up making like chili flakes out of it and strawberry chili hot sauce. You can also grow olives and okra. Firebush is shown on the top there. That's a Florida native plant. There are improved cultivars that are not native to Florida, but firebush is great because it attracts all kinds of native insects and hummingbirds, and the berries are actually edible, but they're not very tasty. Wild coffee, I already showed you guys, that's a fantastic understory plant. And then beauty berries, they look really nice. I wouldn't recommend eating them raw. They're pretty disgusting, but they lend themselves really well to making like jams and things like that because they keep that color in the jam, which is cool. And then one of my favorites here in Florida is pineapple. Again, because it's totally different than store-bought pineapple. This is what they grow on. It's actually a bromeliad that produces a pineapple. And you can see in that picture how juicy they are. Usually I don't eat pineapples too much because I have a tendency to be so acidic that they give me canker sores. The homegrown ones don't though. They are not very acidic at all. They're super sweet. And they do really well here in our climate. And the next layer is the herbaceous layer. I like to think of this as the layer of flowers. Flowers are great in a food forest because they attract pollinators. And because they look great too, because if you want to spend time in your food forest, you want it to be a beautiful place that you want to spend time in. And here are some examples from our climate that do really well. So here is in our backyard. When we first moved in, you can kind of see that row of white gravel there. There was a little square border there. We extended it, made it kind of a more natural curvy shape, and then ended up planting a lot of native wildflowers. And so this was just a few months later. That's tropical sage there, which is a Florida native plant. And you can see partridge pea is the yellow one there with some heliconias in the back. And that area of our yard is just loaded with pollinators. There are also a lot of root crops that grow really well in Florida. Sweet potatoes are super easy. You can take like an old sweet potato from the closet and just like bury it in the ground and it'll produce sweet potatoes. This one I'm highlighting because that was a new one that we harvested just this winter. That's malanga. Malanga, you can find the roots for sale in Publix. What I did was I bought a root for like $2.30 or something, and I soaked it in muck for like a few months, and then it produced those giant elephant ears and then produced more tubers later. And that's a picture of them boiling. They are fantastic for making mashed, I guess it wouldn't be mashed potatoes, mashed malanga, which tastes a little bit like mashed potatoes, but with almost like a sunflower seed combination taste. They're really, really delicious. And then here are just a few examples of some ground covers to keep the soil, keep the soil moist. You don't ever want to have exposed soil in a food forest because you want the soil itself to be both moist and cool so that microorganisms can live there. There are also a lot of cool vines that grow really well here. Passion fruit, that's the Brazilian passion fruit on the right there, is a great one. And that one I started from seed almost 3 years ago, and we finally harvested some passion fruits from it, which I'll show you here in a second. Here are a few other vines and epiphytes that grow really well. These are all pictures from our food forest. So those are those passion fruits that we harvested, and I took out the inside. They have seeds and all of that pulp. You put them in a blender for a little bit just to separate the seeds from the pulp. You can strain out the seeds, and we ended up making passion fruit mousse out of it. And the passion fruit mousse was fantastic. We shared it with my father-in-law, and he's usually not a big dessert person. He tried that. He's like, "You guys need to like sell this at the Strawberry Festival or something." It's like, we're not growing it on that scale yet, but really, really good. And then there are a lot of annuals that also you can grow in a food forest system as well. Obviously, a food forest is all focused on, for the most part, perennials and long-term diversity, but adding annuals in the understory can add a lot of diversity as well seasonally. And then the last category I wanted to highlight, these are pioneer plants. These are plants that do really well when you're first starting out a food forest. They can grow in a little bit more poor conditions, and they can help make the food forest a little bit more, improve the soil quality and make it a little bit better for growing other plants. My top recommendation is mulberries. Mulberries are really fast growing. They tolerate really poor conditions. They fruit really quickly. I took some cuttings from a mulberry just a few weeks ago, and while the cutting was rooting, it was still producing fruit, which was pretty cool. Basically anything that fixes nitrogen is going to be really good as a pioneer plant. The second phase is planting. So again, I would definitely recommend starting with pioneer plants. Don't get analysis paralysis and end up not planting anything. Just plant something. If you have species that are multifunctional, like partridge pea here, it fixes nitrogen, grows really fast, it attracts lots of pollinators. That's a great plant to start with. And when you're planting pioneer plants, the whole goal is just to create a little bit of shade and improve the soil for the later plants that you plant. So here's an example from our food forest. This is a patch of food forest that we hadn't turned into a food forest yet. So what I did the first year was I planted, in the summer, I planted some cowpeas. These were brown crowder cowpeas. And as soon as they grew up, we harvested them, and then I literally just mowed the plants down into the ground and then planted a food forest afterwards because it fertilized the soil for us because they're a nitrogen fixing lagoon. Second thing I would recommend, I mentioned swales earlier. Those are those little trenches that you can dig on contour. Here in Florida, they don't have to be very big. Mine are probably like less than 6 inches deep, but see how they're kind of dug following the contour lines on the property? As the rains come, they'll wash down the slope and then they'll fill up those trenches and spread out. They're basically tree growing systems. So you can see here's another swale that I dug on the upward side of where the food forest patch was. And then when we get those rains, you can see, hopefully in this picture, this is one of those swales, that's the other one, how they fill up with water and they soak it in on the backside and store that water for long-term use. So if you dig swales, it can actually reduce your work in the long run because it'll store water in the wet season and that water will be available for the plants during the dry season. My third tip for planting is mulching everything. Oak leaves are probably the best for this, but you can use branches and wood chips. If you use wood chips, just be careful not to put them too close to the plant itself or they can rob it of nitrogen. You want to keep a little bit of a distance. But basically you just want to mulch to keep the soil temperature down, retain water, protect the surface of the soil, and then also it makes great habitat for soil life. So here's another example. This was a couple years ago when we first started our food forest. You can see all of that leaf litter mulch there. Something else to consider when planting things is you want to plant your heat tolerant things during the summer in the wet season. The best time of year to plant palms, for example, is usually June because they need a lot of water as they're getting established, and you don't have to water them manually as frequently if you plant them right before the rainy season. And then during the dry season, you want to plant things that are a little bit more capable of withstanding those droughts. Because really, in Florida, you think of Florida as being wet and rainy, but it's only seasonally, right? During the winter, there's a lot of period of drought. So we have a spot on our yard that is south facing, and it's the highest spot on the yard. It's really dry and really hot year round. So we've decided to plant a lot of Mediterranean plants on that side. It's our quote unquote Mediterranean zone. Things that can tolerate drought, like olives and jujube and figs, things like that that will work in that kind of climate. And then the last tip for planting is the general rule of thumb for planting fruit trees in Florida is high and tight. That means high meaning you want the root collar, which is where the roots meet the soil surface and or the roots meet the trunk of the tree. You want that to be preferably about 2 inches above the soil line. The single greatest cause of fruit tree failure in Florida is planting your tree at the same depth in the soil that it was in the pot that you got it in. Because what happens is it will sink over time as that soil compacts, and it'll put that root collar below the soil, and that will invite all kinds of disease problems. So if you have it a couple inches above, it gives it a little bit of space to settle out, and it will keep that root collar dry and not buried. And then the second part is just tightly packing in that soil and watering it afterwards. For time's sake, I think I'll skip the maintenance part. It's really not too bad. I might spend maybe an hour or two every weekend maintaining the food forest. If you design, the more work you put in on the front end with design, the better the system's gonna function without your help later. Here are just a few examples of some of the things that we've harvested from our food forest recently. And I'll close by giving a quick example of the transformation of our yard over the past 2 years into a food forest. So this was a couple months before we bought our house. This I pulled from the real estate listing. That's our house at the back. You can see our live oak tree. Notice it's all mostly grass there. And then this was a year and a half later under that same oak tree. It's a different perspective of that same spot there. This is going back to when we first bought the house in May of 2023. You can see a row of pineapples at the back, and that was pretty much it. Then in June, started with the first little food forest patch. By August, it looked like that. By September, you can see that food forest patch is growing in a little bit there. And then by October of last year, it had really grown in quite a bit. And we saw the diversity of insects and everything really skyrocket as this system was growing in. And then of course we got hit by a hurricane and knocked a lot of stuff down. And I'll close with just a few pictures of, food forest doesn't have to be something ugly. Like you can make it beautiful by planting things that are attractive here in Florida. I love the opportunity to be able to grow palms and other things that have a really tropical look. So here are just a few examples of some things from our backyard, including some insects and butterflies, the leafhopper on the top right was really cool. And then just recently saw our first hummingbird clearwing moth. It's a moth that basically acts like a butterfly. That's a picture on the top right, by the way, of a great crested flycatcher just about to leave the nest from its nest box. And this is probably the most common butterfly that we see. This is the Gulf fritillary. So that's all I have for today. Does anybody have any questions about food forests?
We need a field trip to your
Yeah, that would be fun. I'd love to show it off, all the stuff that we're growing and all that.
I have a question about the pineapples. You said homegrown pineapples versus store-bought. Where do you get the homegrown?
In our case, they were already there when we moved in, but the easiest way, so it's less about the cultivar and more about the conditions in which they're grown. So you can take a pineapple from the store, you can eat it, cut the top off of it, and you can bury the top, and it will produce another pineapple. It takes about 3 years for that whole cycle, so you can kind of stagger plant them. Anytime we harvest a pineapple, we cut the top off, plant it somewhere else.
That's why I was asking, cause I have like, 8 pineapple tops growing in glass jars in my foyer.
Yeah.
And I do it from the store-bought pineapples, but I could take those and put them in the yard, and that would be what you would consider homegrown.
Yeah.
Because of the conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really about the conditions in which they're grown and not necessarily about cultivar. There are some improved cultivars that are grown for like flavor and sugar content, but I think it's more about the conditions in which they're grown.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I always thought maybe doing a container garden was better, and now listening to you, I can see why. But my backyard butts up to a road, and everything from the road runs into my yard, which is why I attempted container gardens. What are your thoughts on that?
Container gardening can work really well. You won't necessarily get all of the benefits of the soil microbial life, but you will get the benefits of the above ground diversity if you're growing a bunch of different things. One way to do that is if you have larger containers, if you plant multiple species within the same container, that can add a little bit of diversity. We do container gardening too on our deck, things that are annuals like herbs and a lot of greens, salad greens, things like that.
Right.
But container gardening can be good in the right scenario too. I've seen people actually make a food forest on their balcony in India, grow all kinds of fruit trees in large containers.
Yeah,
So that
I mean, I
can-
have a great big yard, it's, well, compared to others, but, like I said, I have like, the road, the water just runs from the road, and I get weird things in my yard.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense though, to do it in a container setting.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Dr. Kim?
I heard the number of butterflies decreased 22% than before.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Yeah, that one is the same reason. That one is also affecting the planting.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with pesticide application on all of these huge amounts of acreage of fields, and then also in residential settings, because if you apply pesticides to plants that are going to flower and produce food for butterflies, and then the butterflies eat them, it will kill the butterflies. There is a quick side note, you probably hear a lot about monarch butterflies, and people keep trying to list them as endangered species. There was a massive study that was done, I think last year, where they looked at the population trends of monarch butterflies globally and found that their numbers are actually up 10%, and that it's at the highest population level it has ever been. And they said the greatest threat to monarch butterflies is people that think they're going to be endangered and try to raise them in captivity and then release them, because they can introduce captive diseases to wild populations. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you. I'll be here if you guys have any other questions, but I appreciate your time. Thank you.